What's up everybody, it's Joe here with Joseph Lake Photography, and in today's video we're going to talk about it. It's here, the Canon R5 Mark II. Alright, before we jump into the specs, just real quick, two things to note. Number one, I'm going to do a separate video about the R1, their flagship camera. And number two is I do not physically have this camera in my hands. I did not receive a copy, and I wasn't flown to Phoenix, Arizona like the usual suspects to be able to review this camera. No shade on the folks that did or that have videos up this morning that were able to get hands-on with this camera. A handful of folks got a couple of hours with the camera to take a look at it, both the R5 Mark II and the R1. But I am a small YouTuber, and so I have looked at all of those reviews. I have looked at the specs. I watched the announcement this morning, and I've got some thoughts, and we're going to run through it now. And as I go through these things, I'm going to be 100% honest about the things that I got right and the things that I got wrong about this camera. I'm going to tell you, and you be the judge of how right I was or was not, and let me know down in the comments if I did a good job or a bad job. You can also subscribe to this channel or hit the like button if you think I did a good job, and hit the like button twice if you think I did a really bad job. All right, getting into the specs, so getting into the specs on this camera, any camera that is at this level, it starts with the sensor. So let's talk about the sensor. When the R5 first came out, between then and now, there have been rumors flying almost since the day the R5 came out, saying that we'd be getting a higher resolution version of a flagship or high-end Canon full-frame camera, and it never came to fruition. So when we started getting rumors about the R5 Mark II, everybody assumed that it was going to be 60 or 80 megapixels. More megapixels was the answer that everyone seemed to want. And when I started reporting the rumors that it was 45 megapixels, the same as the Gen 1, people roasted me in the comments. They were like, dead on arrival, Canon isn't going to be able to do anything if it's only 45 megapixels. But I would argue that the megapixels are important, but it's more about the technology and the sensor itself. Talk more about that in my video about the R1, but on the R5 specifically, I think the 45 megapixel spot is, I think it's kind of sweet spot, right? Between where the 5D Mark IV was, right? The progenitor of the R and the R5, and where, say, like a 60 megapixel version would be in some other brands. Right there in the middle, I think it really does give us a sweet spot. And now that they are in the second version of this sensor, the new version of this sensor, I think they've been able to bring a lot of new technology to the fore. So still 45 megapixels, but it's a completely different sensor. It is now stacked, which means that the memory and buffer and just all of the stuff that would normally be delivered on a PCB elsewhere in the camera via lanes, is a lot of that technology is now just kind of glued to the back of the sensor. It's all one big chip. It is also a backside illuminated sensor that significantly improves its ability to manage low light performance and color reproduction. It's just a better quality image that you're going to get out of that sensor, which is where you get that additional dynamic range in low light environments and highlight environments where you can film much more contrasty types of situations, whether it's outdoors or a concert venue or places where you can't really control the lighting. That's why the sensor is so important. You want resolution, but more than anything, you want dynamic range and you want speed. So on the speed front, a couple things specifically about this new sensor. Number one, it has, according to Canon, a slightly slower readout than the R3, which is a big deal because the R3 is positioned as a higher end camera than the R5, and the R5 is a higher megapixel camera. So the fact that it is only slightly slower in terms of readout tells you that they have put a lot of additional technology into this camera. And with the electronic shutter, you can shoot at 1/32,000th of a second. I had reported, I think, 1/16,000th, so it's 1/32,000th of a second, which, if you're shooting action, you want not only that high shutter speed, but you also want that high readout speed so that you don't get distortion in your images. That's super important. The other thing that's really important when we talk about the sensor is its sensitivity. We talked about the fact that it's a BSI sensor. The base ISO for this sensor is 51,200, but it has the ability to go up to 1,000 or 102,400. I'm getting those numbers backwards. But because of the additional chip, which we'll talk about in a second, it has the ability to really smooth out and work on the noise reduction in camera, which is nice if you're trying to get those images out quickly. Although I would say that with the kind of advancements that we have in like Lightroom, Photoshop, other products out there on the market to be able to do neural network machine learning based noise reduction, which in some cases is just absolutely incredible. I'm not sure that this is necessarily needed on camera, but the sensitivity level being up at 104/200 is pretty cool. So still talking about the sensor itself, it still brings dual pixel autofocus version 2, but now again, due to this additional chip, it does unlock additional AI features. So from what I can see, there is no improvement on the sensor when it comes to the autofocus system. That, however, is the case in the R1, which I'll talk about in my other video. And lastly, on the sensor, you've got 12 frames per second mechanical, along with 30 frames per second electronic, with the ability to actually customize your burst modes to be more specific. So it's not just continuous high and high plus as it was before. You now have a lot of different configuration options where you can add different frame rates to your different burst modes. And still talking about the sensor, it still comes with the in-body image stabilization, although that has been improved, and now they are measuring up to 8.5 stops, up from 8 stops of in-body image stabilization when connected to an RF lens that's compatible with IS. And that is in the center of the image, where the outside of the image, because again, because of the way geometry works, as that sensor moves, the outside of the sensor is going to move more than the inside of the sensor. So they're saying that they're going to get 8.5 stops in the center and 7.5 in the periphery. That's why that is, because the sensor moves. Okay, now let's go into the camera, right? From the sensor to the chips. So we still have the Digic X, but now we've added the Digic accelerator chip. And really, what I think is that this chip is giving, instead of building a new whole processor from the ground up, Canon is kind of bolting on an additional processor to do the additional work that the Digic X can't. The Digic X, I think, still has a lot of headroom left in it. I think if you look back, since the R5 and R6 came out, since then, I think really this whole story of Canon's mirrorless cameras have been the Digic X. I think that has been the thing that has really made all of this possible. Combine that with an additional chip that allows them to add features like people priority, where it will actually remember specific people. This is going to be great for family events and weddings and sports and things where you want to remember a person's face. The action priority autofocus system, which now allows you to track objects even if they are hidden from view, and it will effectively map out where it thinks it's going to go and kind of predict its motion. We talked about that in a lot of our previous videos. As well as adding features like the neural engine noise management of higher ISO images. There's also an upscaling feature built into the camera. These, I believe, are all something that is possible as a result of this new accelerator chip. So much so that they've actually changed the name of dual pixel autofocus to dual pixel AI focus or intelligence focus. So I believe that the speed and capability of this sensor and the Digic X processor combined with this new accelerator chip is really going to be the story in this camera. But that's not all. They've also added a whole bunch of bells and whistles and features and things along the way. So we do now have eye control AF in the viewfinder, and the viewfinder now is this just absolutely gigantic and gorgeous thing. So not only is it awesome and adds IAF, it's much larger, it's brighter, and it allows for completely blackout free shooting. The last thing that I'll say on the autofocus modes or situation as we talk about IAF is the fact body, eye, face, animal, and vehicle tracking. Those were a part of the R5. And now, through action priority mode in the R5 Mark II, you now have different types of sports and they've added the people priority mode from the R3. But remember, the R3 is the Digic X. Again, the story I'm trying to paint here is that the Digic X is still doing a lot of this work, and that some of these new features are actually just because they've added this new chip, this Digic accelerator. So we know that dual pixel autofocus 2 on the Digic X with body, face, eye, animal, vehicle tracking is possible with IAF and people priority. All of that possible with the Digic X. You add the Digic X accelerator, the Digic accelerator, and what you end up with is these action priority modes to do all the predictive tracking. That's what's been added, as well as, I'm sure, kind of speeding up the rest of the workflow. One thing we had heard was that there was a potential upgrade to the varied angle screen. It doesn't look like we're getting that here, although the menus have been updated to include a lot more functions, and something else we talked about in a previous video, a lot of the cinema features and cinema menu options that were available on the R5C have been added into the R5, Mark II. On the video side of things, here are the updates. Still 8K, obviously, but now 8K 60 RAW internal, up from 30. And now there are options for a small RAW format to help out on some of those cards and hard drives. And while it still allows you to shoot 10-bit 422 internally, if you're not shooting RAW, you can also shoot that non-log. So you can shoot full 10-bit video without having to be in log profile, which would speed up your editing workflow down the road if you're not looking for a lot of the dynamic range that comes with a log profile. On the subject of log profiles, you now have C-Log 2, which means that this camera can stand up as a B cam along with any of the cinema line cameras as an additional option, or you could put multiples together to be able to match color from camera to camera, which is phenomenal. Again, I did a video where we talked about the fact that the Canon, the R5C was a weird one-off where the R5 just couldn't do what they wanted to do with the R5C because of heat limitations, because of the issues with overheating. So they came out with the R5C with its cooling as an answer to that. Well, now we have all these video features in the R5, like 4K 120 with sound internally, and also not at 30 frames a second. It's actually 120 frame per second file, and just tons and tons of cinema configuration options inside this camera that, again, you would normally only see in a cinema line camera. This is effectively a cinema line camera with all of these features. And they're doing it without heating issues because, moving on to the ergonomics and the outside of this camera, it has cooling now. There is a vent that allows for passive cooling for cold air to enter the camera and warm air to leave. And again, as I reported in a previous video, there are 3 different grips that you're going to be able to purchase with this camera that will act both as battery extensions as well as active cooling, and adding the additional buttons for you to be able to go vertical or horizontal on this camera. And speaking of the batteries, there's a new one. This camera apparently pulls a little bit more amperage than the traditional Canon batteries can provide, and so Canon has created a new battery that has a little bit more amperage. My understanding is that older cameras will accept this battery with a firmware update to get the additional power that it can provide. Although I would venture to guess that either this battery, either the R5 without this battery will not work at all, although from what I've seen it will, but I'm going to guess that there's going to be some limitations. Again, because this isn't a question of how long the battery will last, this is a voltage amperage issue, so it's delivering more power to the camera directly, power that it needs. My assumption is that that means that this camera will not function in every aspect without this additional bit of amperage. You had the same thing with the R5, the R6 Mark II, where you needed to have both the right lens and the right battery, if you remember correctly, to get those high speed 20 frame per second shooting modes, right? You couldn't get high frame rate plus H plus without the LP6EN battery. You couldn't just get it with the LP6, I think. I'm probably getting those numbers wrong, but I know that, I know because it happened to me. I had an R6, I plugged in the old battery, and boom, that H plus light just started blinking. I was like, no, this isn't gonna work. It wouldn't even work if the battery wasn't fully charged, like you had to be at 100% charge. So I'm going to assume that there will be some features or specs that will not fully function if you're using an older battery, or the camera won't work at all. But these batteries will work in older cameras with a firmware update. We do not know how far back into the line Canon will provide that firmware update. Will they go back all the way to the 60D? We'll find out. Still one CF Express B, one UHS 2 slot. I would really love to see dual SD and dual CF Express A. Tell me down in the comments why that's a bad idea. I'm sure there's a reason, but I don't know it. I don't shoot with CF Express. The cameras that I shoot on are still SD. But tell me down in the comments why CF Express A SD card combos are a bad idea. Tell me down in the comments. Let me know. I want to know. Experts, give me the info. Also on the video side of things, this camera will allow, while shooting 8K, to be able to shoot JPEGs. So you can take JPEG stills while you're shooting 8K. I mean, that makes sense, right? If this camera can do 45 megapixel at 30, 40 frames per second, and then it's doing this, 8K ingest, I don't see why it wouldn't be able to pull frames out of that and just make them stills. That makes sense to me. Also on the outside, we've got the digital hot shoe that we were expecting. Again, bringing it in line with the most modern versions of Canon cameras, as well as now a full-size HDMI port. Okay, so to summarize, this is definitely a Mark II. This is an update to the R5, similar to how the R6 Mark II was an update to the R6. They have given us a lot of the things that we wanted, made some improvements that we were looking for, and to be honest, did some things that seemed pretty obvious. Just bringing things in line with the more modern versions, the R6 Mark II, the R3, other full frame cameras that we have. So this seems like an absolutely phenomenal camera, and it has honestly so many things in it, especially when you think about the fact that they've kind of folded in all of the cinema specs that you had on the R5C and the customizability and all that kind of stuff. Just there's so much here, along with the cooling. Like, they literally just went through and checked every box. I wish it hadn't taken 4 years, to be quite honest. But it's nice to see that Canon continues to iterate and change. A couple of things that I'm not really sure about. Number one is the pixel shift and this up-resing, as well as the noise reduction. I don't know, noise reduction is great, but really a lot of us aren't gonna be doing a lot of noise reduction in camera. We're gonna be doing that off camera in post to save time. The pre-shoot function, right? You have pre-shoot on other cameras, and now it's coming to the R5 line. But so when you half press on the camera, it's going to start a pre-roll, and once you press and start shooting, it will save. But if you're shooting 30 frames per second, it's a half a second of pre-shoot, which means that you're always going to have frames of additional shooting, even if you didn't want them, as opposed to like 2 or 4 or 6 or 10 or something. I wouldn't mind having 5, like that sounds about right, but you can't customize it. So maybe in a firmware update, they'll change that, but right now that's not something that you can do. And then lastly are the things that we weren't sure about. I'll be real honest, in the specs that we've been getting and the reporting that I had done and kind of the things that we had guessed about, we didn't get a lot wrong. Pretty much everything here was spot on with what we were anticipating, plus or minus a few things that were a little different. But most of it is pretty much on par with what we expected. Where the gap was in terms of our knowledge was how much of this camera would we get from the R1? How many of the R1 flagship features would we get in this camera as well, since we knew they were going to come out around the same time? So other than the date where we expected this camera to be announced in May, everything else was pretty much on par. But those things that we didn't expect, or those things that we weren't sure about, were specifically the autofocus functions and whether or not the R5 Mark II would be getting everything from the R1 in terms of all of that tracking, and whether or not we would get the IAF from the R3. And we got both. Although you'll see in my R1 video, there are a few differences. I think those differences are pretty minor, which then begs the question, if you add a battery grip to this thing, do we need the R3? I mean, this thing beats it in almost every category. On top of the fact that you're getting dangerously close to the R1 in terms of specs. You're also getting dangerously close in terms of price, because with a grip, this camera will be more expensive than the R3. The grips are going to be a couple $100, and the R5 right now is estimated to be priced out at $4,299, $4,300. It's $500 more than the previous version. I'm not necessarily going to quibble with that price, but what I will say is that that puts the R3 into a weird place, and it makes sense why they increased the price for the R1 from what we anticipated is $59.99. So again, we got pretty much everything right. Everything is what we expected. It's what we've been waiting for. Price a little higher than we thought it was going to be. It's a little bit later than we thought it was going to be. And we got more features than we were expecting. So I guess it's a win overall. Obviously, we'll need to see this camera in action. We'll have photographers who are using it day after day who will tell us what's good, what's bad, what's weird. But what I will say is that this camera seems to be in a really weird spot as being effectively the entry level to the cinema line with a full frame sensor and tons of cinema features like waveforms and all that sort of thing, while also being almost its best still shooter at 45 megapixels with 30 frames per second electronic and a super fast readout. Tell me how the other two cameras above it make sense unless you need that absolute little sliver of better. Tell me in the comments. I'm probably wrong. My assumption is probably incorrect. So tell me down in the comments where I'm missing this. Let me know. I want to hear from you. And if this is the kind of thing that you're into, this information, cameras, gear, all this stuff, please, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Go ahead and hit like on this video if it's the kind of thing that you're into. Go ahead and hit the bell if you are interested in being alerted when I create new videos. Find me on Instagram, find me on all the places, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.